Perfect, thanks. I hope most of you have had breakfast because this might make you a bit hungry today. I chose a theme this year. Those of you who have been here in the past know that I like to try to use analogies and metaphors to help you think outside the box, if I may use a typical phrase. And this year I chose to talk about cooking and kitchens and thinking about digital asset management as a kitchen. And I'm going to talk about what's going on today in DAM in the context of putting together ingredients in your own kitchen. So hopefully you think about your own digital asset management environment and what the different ingredients are that you might need to create successful dishes and successful brand experiences. So with that, I'm going to tell you a little story. This is a place that exists about a half-hour drive north of New York City. You take a rather old, decrepit highway out of Manhattan, and you end up in this spot. And it's a beautiful place. It's very similar, actually, that if you were to drive about a half hour to an hour outside of London, you find beautiful farmhouses that are made of ancient brick and stone. In this case, this is an old Rockefeller estate. Many of his estates have been converted into beautiful homes or hotels, and in this case, it's a restaurant. This today is a manifestation of a single culinary genius, a guy named Dan Barber. Some of you may have heard of him. The UK equivalent might be someone like Heston Blumenthal. And it's a very similar experience if you go out to Bray here and you go to the Fat Duck. It's sort of a very similar experience going out of New York City to this particular place. And eating here is really like experiencing a great piece of art. It's like watching a Martin Scorsese film, for example, or it's like watching Kevin Spacey give a beautiful monologue on stage here at the Old Vic. It's a singular, beautiful artistic experience. And when you go in and you start to experience what he creates, it's often very simple. Vegetables. So here's an example of what you often get as the first course. It's just beautiful, colorful vegetables with a little bit of salt. It's almost like he knows that he has these beautiful farm products, these beautiful assets, essentially, that he has grown from the earth, and simply enhances it with a little bit of something, right? Salt. Salt is perhaps the most beautiful, simple enhancement we can give to food. And it's something that just takes the essence and sort of enhances it to make it a little bit better. And I wonder how many of us are thinking of our assets that way? Or are we thinking we have to sort of over-massage them and sort of over-change them in a way that might actually mask them from what they really are? So that's the first thing to think about. What is the essence of our assets? How can we take our digital assets, display them in a way that's perhaps revealing most of their essence? He will sometimes enhance an ingredient and sort of take it to the next level of complexity. And this is something we also think about doing with our digital assets sometimes. So in this case, you have a few leafy greens, and then you also have a sort of variation on the leafy green. And it allows you to experience the food in three different ways, even though it's either the same ingredient or a very similar ingredient. So they know how to take ingredients and adapt them, and take one ingredient and create many renditions of that ingredient. So this is another way to think about our own digital assets over the next couple days. And what is the technology we need to do that? What's fun also is the idea of co-creation with some of these assets. So sometimes they'll put them in front of you, and they'll actually give you some kind of tool, like a scissors. Oftentimes, you're not given anything, right? So these dishes, in fact, were in front of us, and there was absolutely no utensils. You could take your hands, you could use your fingers, and could you do the same thing with your own assets, with your consumers, with your end users? Give them tools, or maybe not give them tools, to experience in a different way. Here's Dan in the kitchen. That's Dan Barber. Maybe some of you have seen him before. Interestingly, this particular evening, all these pictures were taken by my husband. We had a particular seat in the kitchen. And that's where I was inspired to this particular presentation, because I was really impressed with how well coordinated the workflow was in this kitchen. It was incredible. This is one of the top restaurants in the United States, and many would say the world. And it is amazing how each person in the kitchen has a very specific role, understands their role, is focused on the role, and also is very, very good at communicating to everyone around them where they are in terms of what they are doing. So this is another thing that's really important as we think about our assets and how can we be successful in creating assets as they get more complex. What are the specialized roles that everyone is playing? You'll notice in this picture, I think this was a cardoon wrapped with sesame, right? So this is an increasingly more complex assets that were coming out on the table here. In the back left, you'll note that Dan has someone that he's speaking with that has a brown jacket on. And at one point over the course of the evening, one of the farmers came in. Okay, so one of the important things to understand about this restaurant is that it's actually in the middle of farmland, which is part of why Manhattanites love to drive out and be in the countryside, even though it's not very far from the city, because they're really getting in touch with the source of the food. And in this particular case, the farmer came in and all of a sudden a bunch of the chefs sort of gathered around the farmer because he actually walked in with some ingredients. And they really wanted to talk about the ingredient, they wanted to smell the ingredient, they wanted to kind of get their mind going about what they could do with it. And for those of you working with digital assets, how connected are you to those assets? How in touch are you with the people who are creating them originally? So there's a communication back and forth as to what you might be able to do to get the input from the people that are creating it and growing it and enhancing it. And then how do you take it to the next level? Now, of course, as the night goes on, you'll also see over here in the top left, the orders start coming in, right? There's the diners, there's the consumers, and there's a lot of pressure, right, that starts to happen where all of a sudden there's a lot of orders lined up, the amount of work that has to churn out gets increasingly more complex, and the tickets, as they're called, get lined up across the board. And they look something like this. This picture isn't particularly from Stone Barns. It's just a picture of a sort of workflow, as I like to call it, that would be typical in a restaurant. And it's very impressive if you've ever worked in a restaurant how these particular systems for organizing tickets can make or break a kitchen, very specifically. How they're lined up. What's the language that they use? What's the metadata they use to communicate how the orders need to happen, the order that they need to happen in, the timing of each of them, how they might need to be personalized because someone has an allergy, or because someone doesn't like something in particular, or because they want 2 appetizers rather than an appetizer and a main dish. All the exceptions to the rule are just as complex as the rules themselves. And this is another thing we sometimes forget when it comes to creating our own asset workflows. We want to systematize them, and we don't necessarily want to account for the variations. But what you can see here is that they use, for example, red text to separate appetizers from main courses. They also mark with the time that the first dish went out versus the second dish went out. Are you thinking about your workflows in the same way? Are you thinking about how your consumers are also getting the flow of your assets? Is it optimal? Is it personalized? Is it very specific for what they need? So let's look at the Stone Barns kitchen and what it might look like. This is actually my own interpretation of what it looked like in the kitchen that night. And I worked with a sort of artist here to have a sense of it and to give you a sense of it. You can see in the bottom left there was the chef's table. That's where I was sitting when I was having this experience taking these pictures. And they had all these sort of prep stations along the far side of the kitchen where there were people, again, very specialized, very focused on a particular task: whisking eggs, chopping vegetables, making dough, mixing ingredients. And they had a whole bunch of stoves at one section and then a whole bunch of ovens to the far left. And again, I was really impressed with how focused and specialized people were. And then as things moved from one stage to the other, they yelled or communicated it out in a very deliberate way: hot dish, hot dish, hot dish, get out of the way, right? And it was really amazing to see that no one ever ran into each other. It was very focused. It was very high levels of communication. No one was sitting there quiet, working in their own little world, complaining about everybody next to them and saying, well, if that person did their job better, then surely everything would be fine, right? It was a very positive, free-flowing environment. One thing that was really interesting was that every once in a while, one of the chefs, probably the executive chef or the person who works right below Dan Barber, who's sort of in charge of the kitchen, he would yell something out like, "Are we here to be successful tonight? You know, are we here to deliver beautiful dishes to the people in the restaurant? Are we all on the same page as far as what we're doing?" And they would all yell in a chorus, and they would say, "Yes." It was like hearing a sports team before they went out to play in the World Cup. And this whole chorus of yes kept coming into the kitchen because there was a unified vision as far as what they were doing. And that was a very kind of inspiring thing. So that's another thing I would put in front of you today and over the next couple days as you consider your own asset workflows, your own asset initiatives, your own marketing initiatives, media initiatives, whatever they are. How do you get your team to that spirit? You know, that spirit of yes, where everybody is focused on their task, everybody knows their task, everybody communicates with one another, and they come together in a chorus of yes. How do you do that? That's really our challenge as digital asset managers, as media managers, as brand managers, as marketers. That's what we need to get to. What can we, in the industry, learn from the great kitchens of the world? But also, what's cooking up right now in terms of our industry? What tools do we have to choose from? What are the technologies that we might use? What are the methodologies that we might use to be successful? So let's talk about what some of those are. La mise en place. So for those of you who have ever worked in the food industry, mise en place is getting everything in place before you start cooking. That's really important. This is a mise en place for a very famous soup in Southeast Asia. Can anyone guess what it is? Pho, right, somebody said it. Okay, right, this is a mise en place for pho, which is the most famous, iconic Vietnamese soup that they often have for breakfast. And if you walk through streets in any place in Vietnam, you will see usually women on the side of the road with a mise en place to make this beautiful soup. And they have a bubbling broth, and they will put the different ingredients in. And even if it's the most basic street stall, all the way up to a beautiful high-end restaurant where they're serving pho, they always have the mise en place. Many digital asset management initiatives today, they take off before there's a mise en place. The content isn't ready. There is no metadata for the content. They say, let's just dump it all in the system and surely it will work fine. Right? If you start making a soup this complex, you can see there's about 12, 13 different ingredients here. And part of what makes this particularly complex is that when you order pho, you have choices. You can say, I want the beef tendon, I want this part of the particular meat, I want chicken, or I want pork, or I want something. You have all these different options. You have ways of personalizing your experience. And if you don't have the mise en place, you're not able to deliver it right, or there's a delay, or you might put the wrong thing in if you don't put the ingredients in the same place every day and sort of get it arranged properly. So before you start your DAM initiatives, think about this. Think about your mise en place. And think about what should be where and how do I systematize that before I set out to take the order from my customer. So the mise en place is equally important for how you want it to look when it rolls out. What does this marketing asset look like? How does this media get experienced? Is it on an iPad? Is it on my high definition television? Is it in a bento box? Right? Where I can actually have these beautiful divisions of food so that I know how to navigate my way through the meal. Right? I'm not accidentally in this experience going to eat something sweet before I eat something savory. It's very clear what goes where. You need to think about your assets in the same way. Mise en place on the way in, and then how do I want it to be on the way out? Another thing that's very important is infrastructure. Bringing many simple things together in an effective way is very, very powerful. This is a hawker center in Singapore. I had my first trip to Singapore earlier this year, and one of the things that I just loved about Singapore was how absolutely fabulous the infrastructure was for everything. Now, in a hawker center, if you're not familiar with a hawker center, this is Singapore's answer to street food, but they've brought all the different street food vendors into a single infrastructure. It's kind of like aggregation platform. Lots of different technologies brought together under a single roof. And in this particular case, it was exceptional because you have specialists, again, niche specialists. No one here makes 5 or 6 or 200 things. They make usually one thing, like chicken and rice, or fruit beverages, or meat on a stick. Very, very specific. And they bring it together with tables and with clean toilets and with all of these wonderful things that I, as a consumer and as a food lover, really appreciated. Because I could figure out, okay, who specializes in what. I can go in, and it's all around this infrastructure where someone actually comes and cleans the tables afterwards, and I'm having this wonderful foodie experience. So think about, what is your infrastructure? Are you actually bringing together different technologies, different specialties under one roof in a way that works together? Assets change. It's another very important thing. This is brie, or camembert. I forget. I think it's camembert, given the shape. Okay. This was a camembert that got left out at a wedding that I attended in France last summer. And it was amazing because they had all these camemberts during the cheese course, and they just started oozing all over the place. And then they eventually would come up with these, what's called a bloc fromage. It's a little sort of slate thing that you put up against the cheese so it doesn't ooze all over the table, basically. It was a way of responding to the change in the asset, right? So that's another thing that you need to be thinking about. How are you responding to the changes in your assets? Because they will evolve. They will change. You will need different metadata. So when you're done with that taxonomy project that was so important, when you're done setting up that metadata, then your consumers want something different. Or you have new content. Or you have new goals. Your assets will change. Your business needs will evolve. And you need to think about how to adapt to the oozing cheese. Because of that, I can't underemphasize enough the importance of agile development. This is my nephew. His name's Tony. I spend a lot of time with him. He goes to school about 2 blocks from my home in Philadelphia. And he's a big foodie, so he gets along very well with his Aunt Theresa. And he likes to come to my house, and he likes to taste food and spend time with me and talk about food. And I would love it to think someday he would be a chef. But he had an idea one day. He said, "Why are there no meat smoothies?" He really loves smoothies, and he also loves bacon. But he said, all these smoothies, they're always so healthy and they're full of fruit, and I sort of put all these fruit in smoothies. And, you know, Aunt Theresa, why don't we have an experiment to try a meat smoothie? And I said, okay. So I said, well, what do you think would go well together? What are the kind of ingredients that would mix up and work for you? And he says, well, I love bacon. And he said, I love Hawaiian pizzas. And if you're not familiar with Hawaiian pizzas, it's usually ham and cheese and pineapple on a pizza. So I said, okay, let's try that. So one day after school, this was around his 9th birthday, he came over and we stuck the pineapples and we stuck the bacon and we stuck the yogurt in the blender and mixed them up and tasted it. It was awful. It was dreadful. I mean, it tasted really bad. It just wasn't a good mix. And I said, Tony, don't be disappointed. I mean, he was really upset. He was practically in tears because he had this idea and he thought it was such a great idea and it just failed miserably. And I said, Tony, it's okay. You know, this is why we have to experiment. Right? We have to test. We have to take different ingredients. We have to take different technologies. We have to put them together in the blender and mix them up and figure out if they actually work together well. Do they integrate? Do they function? Do they taste good together? Do they create good output for the user? A lot of times they don't. So the importance of that cannot be underemphasized in our industry. It's another thing to think about over the next couple days. Are you willing to experiment? Are you too scared to do it? Are you too intimidated that you won't look good in front of your boss because you're proposing a crazy idea like a meat smoothie? Don't be intimidated by that. It'll hold you back. And it's okay occasionally, especially in technology, to have the occasional failure, refine on that, make it better, and take it to the next level. Finally, what are the tools? And for that, I'm going to go back to Dan Barber. And as you watch this short video, think about the tools that you are using. Are they the right tools? Are they the right technology? And don't underestimate the importance of the right tool. And often, don't underestimate the versatility of the right tool.
My favorite gadget, from the beginning of when I was cooking is a spoon, like the right size spoon. All the cooks think I'm crazy in both the kitchens at Blue Hill because I only have one size spoon that we use the entire time. Like, and cooking kitchens you generally see like different stations have different size spoons, like big shovel spoons, and sometimes small ones, depending on what your job is. I use one spoon, and I think it's the right size spoon for plating and the right size spoon for tasting. It's not too big, it's not too small. And I want everyone to have the same consistency, because the spoon, you know, whether you're flipping a piece of fish or a piece of meat, or you're mixing vegetables, or you're stirring rice, or whatever it is, the spoon is just this great extension of your hand. You know, it becomes like the closest thing you can get to your hand, where you're in control of the food, really in control of the food. Like these tongs and these forks, like, ugh, they're nowhere near the kitchen, because they tend to have this relationship with food that's very dispassionate and literally detached. Whereas the spoon, if you hold it close, you're in control of, you know, you're mastering what you're preparing. And I think that, you know, spreads itself out across the kitchens in ways that end up having tastier food.
So what's your spoon? How are you staying creative? How are you really thinking about your assets and your consumers? What is your spoon? So let's talk about that for a second. And in that context, we'll talk a bit about the market. You know, I find that, you know, with cooking, that, you know, sometimes the simplest tools are the most useful. This is a woman in Thailand. It was on my Southeast Asia trip earlier this year, where all she did was use a wok to fry bananas, right? She had a business, her family actually had, you know, generations of people who just fried bananas. Right? So what's your business model, your business, your assets? How are you thinking about what the perfect, you know, tool is? She doesn't change the equation if it works, right? Just frying up some bananas here. Simple output, simple input. Or I should say simple input, simple output. What's difficult when it comes to selecting a tool is that where you want to go might be obvious, but the how might not be. Okay? So you say, okay, well, this is what I want. This is the output I want, but I don't necessarily know the tool I want. So as we think about the DAM kitchen, usually on the prep stations, you probably have a whole bunch of specific things that you use to create assets. Cameras, editing suites, different sorts of technology that's the input. And then they're passed on to certain editorial tools that allow you to do splicing and dicing and merging and collections of different assets together. And then finally, there's some sort of output medium. There's printers, there's tablets, there's computers. And then finally, there's what I would call the plating up. Right before the dish goes out, you have to think about, how's this going to look on social media? How's it going to look on Facebook? How's it going to look on whatever, Twitter? And you need to think about your tools in the same way. Okay? What's the preparation tools? What's the editing tools? What's the output tools? And then what are the plates that I'm serving them up on? Because at each stage, you have influence over your assets in that regard. And you have the ability to change, to adjust. And then, of course, how are you going to get your team to that course of yes? Okay, we're on the same page. These are the tools we're using. We're in agreement here. This is our spoon. And we're going to use this particular tool in this particular instance to be effective and to make it work. All right, now I'm going to get a little techie here. And hopefully this will get you thinking about the tools specifically in the digital asset management marketplace. I like to talk about a distinction in the market that's very important, which is platforms versus products. This is the difference between a spoon and a immersion blender with 15 different parts. Okay, if I may continue with that cooking metaphor. Platforms are very complex things, software products that you can buy that are a whole bunch of different ingredients that allow you to do what you would like with the tool. It's the equivalent of buying 20 different ingredients that 10 different people will have completely different outputs with those ingredients. So if I give everybody on this side of the room a bunch of ingredients to make a dish versus everybody on this side of the room, you might come up with 2 totally different dishes. That's the case if you buy a complex technology platform as well. You're getting not just the spoon, but the whisk and the plates and everything that you might use versus a product. Products are simple, out of the box, not very modifiable pieces of technology. And there's a lot of those. It allows you to, for example, subscribe to a hosted software as a service, put your assets in very quickly, not have to do a lot of technical integration, and you get a quick out of the box DAM. Now, there's a lot of information on this slide, and I point this out because typically platform-oriented companies that want to buy very complex technology, they have a lot of work set out for themselves. Okay? It's like walking into a master kitchen and having 200 ingredients and 50 different tools that you can do anything with those ingredients. And you're creating essentially a lot of work for themselves, or yourselves, I should say. Products, actually, I'm finding increasing interest in because our DAM world is very complex. And people who have worked in DAM for a long time tend to be very, in some cases, disillusioned because they've worked with so much complex technology. And they say, I want something simpler. I just want a spoon. I just want one tool that everybody can understand in a very simple way, rather than having to teach somebody how to use a very complex immersion blender with 20 moving parts. So you need to think about where you fit on this spectrum. We see it as a spectrum. We cover about 40 different vendors in this particular space in DAM. And we subdivide into different groups, specifically because there is so much choice. Okay, do you want a simple spoon, or do you want a very complex, multi-dimensional platform that allows you to ingest assets, convert assets, modify and edit assets while they're in your system, do multi-channel deployment, all kinds of different stages. And unfortunately, what I find kind of unfortunate about the market is that there's a lot of simpler products out there that really are actually quite inexpensive, that you could subscribe to for 500 to 2,000 pounds a month, that are subscription DAM services that are moving up market. They're making themselves more complex. They're making themselves more expensive. And so that's something you'll have to think about as well. You know, do you want a simple tool, a subscription service that you can put your assets into that maybe doesn't give you a lot of functionality, but it's a spoon, allows you to do most of what you need to do? Or do you want something a lot more complex that's going to require a development team, that's going to require a huge kitchen of people to run it, to maintain it, and to integrate it with other tools? And there are times when, yes, you're going to need that. If you're a large, multinational company that wants to personalize, that has a lot of product data, that has a lot of customer data, you probably do need a more complex tool. But don't buy a more complex tool if you don't need it. It's the #1 problem I see still. I've been in this market for about 7 years. People overbuy. They overbuy. They spend a lot more than they need to on technology to make things happen and to make things work. Okay. When it comes to ingredients, there's a lot of selection out there. To use a travel metaphor or travel analogy rather than a kitchen analogy for a moment, this is our tube map. And this looks at all the different technologies that are out there that do content and product marketing, digital asset management, and different aspects of what we're all trying to accomplish every day. Specifically, you might be working with several of these particular technology vendors. Okay? And each of the lines represents a different area that these particular vendors specialize in. So some of them specialize in media management, meaning video, audio, broadcast. Some of them specialize in image management. Some of them specifically specialize in document management, marketing assets. Some of them specialize in product information management. So when it comes to building your DAM kitchen, you have a lot of ingredients to pick from. The question is, are you willing to experiment, have them work together, figure out if they can work well together, and mix them together in the best possible way for you? I always recommend using use cases as evaluation criteria. Those of you I know who have picked a system, working with many of the smart consultant firms in this room, have done this sort of approach, where you say, okay, what am I focused on as a business, or what is my group focused on when I select this technology? Of the 40 or so vendors that we evaluate, we rate them all based on these use case criteria, and there's very few that do well in more than 1 or 2 areas. So if you have short form video needs, and you also have marketing asset management needs for print, you might not be able to do that with the same technology. Typically, we see large organizations with 2 or 3 different tools to do this. So the more complex your situation, you might need a little bit more than a spoon. So think about these scenarios. Think about technologies When I say technology fit, I say this because many organizations say, well, we're technology agnostic. No organization is technology agnostic. No organization is technology agnostic. It's very important to remember that. There are people in your organization with certain technical skills. You need to know what those are, because plugging in the wrong ingredient here is going to cause challenges. So think about, what's the scenario fit for you? What's the technology fit? What's the partner fit? Does this company understand you, your business, what you need to do, what your use cases are? Do they understand your industry? Do they understand you? Are they a good fit? And then finally, the value fit. Value fit is super important. What is your budget? Establish that up front. Otherwise, you're going to waste a lot of time. It's much easier to narrow down the right ingredients for you if you know that you can't afford the caviar. Be honest. Get that out front right away. Finally, from a staffing perspective, one of the reasons I see these initiatives fail quite often is because people don't really dedicate enough time and people to these projects. It ends up being 10% of many different people. DAM tends to be an innovation project in organizations. It tends to be new. It tends to be something that's not been around before. So think of it as an innovation project. And what we typically see with innovation, and this is a really good book if you've never read it, written by Chris Trimble, who's a professor at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth in New England. And the other side of innovation is about the execution side. It's kind of easy to have the idea. Let's face it, we've all had good ideas. The harder part is making it happen. And what he saw and what he found is that generally it's 5% of everybody dedicated to innovation projects, and that's why they tend to fall along the wayside. What he sees and what his study showed was successful is if you take 10% of your staff and dedicate 100% of their time, you're going to be that much more successful with your project. So you need to fight for that. You really need to fight for that. You can't have your chefs in the kitchen doing 10 different things, for 5 minutes every day. It doesn't work. So you can buy the best technology, you can make all the effort in the world, but if you don't dedicate people to it, you're not going to get very far. Innovation is sometimes just a tweak. Sometimes it's just a variation on the theme. So maybe you have really great technology already and you just need to take it to the next level. Just like if you sold meatballs on a stick, you can make a lot more revenue and a lot more you can get a lot more customers just by putting some new ingredients on sticks. You can think that way too. Sometimes the best innovation projects happen that way. Finally, remember that negativity won't get you anywhere. This is not from Stone Barns. This is just a random picture of what sometimes happens in the kitchen. And I bring this up because I do encounter a lot of negativity as an analyst, as a consultant, as an outsider who goes into organizations. Sometimes I feel like a therapist because people complain to me about this other person and they say, can you give this person some input onto how they can change? And I just say, no, you have to talk to that person. You have to work with that person. Don't send subliminal messages through your employees and complain about the person up the line. Negativity will not be tolerated. We are in the business of creating beautiful, compelling, and consumable assets. What are your beautiful assets? What do you need to create them? What are the ingredients? Is a spoon enough for you? Do you need a full suite of tools? Should you go simple? Should you go complex? This is my final example and my final pictures because I had a beautiful conversation while I was sitting in the Stone Barns kitchen with the gentleman who was creating these fried leaves or baked leaves. Some of them were fried and some of them were baked. And he worked in an oven that was to the immediate left of the chef's table. And he was so focused on what he was doing. He was taking leaves, brushing them with olive oil, either putting them in a fryer or putting them in the oven and taking them out. And he was building these beautiful trees. So these are chips. These are kale leaves. They are spinach leaves, various beetroot, sweet potato, etc. Building these beautiful trees. And I asked him, I said, do you mind if I talk with you while you while you create these? He said, sure, no problem. I said, is this a tedious job? Is it difficult for you to do this for hours every day? And I was shocked because he looked up, he stopped what he was doing, and he looked up at me and he said, not at all. He said, I am living my dream. I love this. He said, I create beautiful things every day. And he said, yes, it's repetitive. He said, but I always feel like I could do it better. And I see people smile every night when I serve them these beautiful things. So think about that too. Is that how you think about your day? Is that how you think about your assets? Are you thinking about them as beautiful things that will make people happy, that will engage people, that will get them involved? And with 2 minutes to spare, thank you.